My name is Chris, and I live in a small town in north-central North Carolina. This first story takes place on the farm where I grew up. I was around 14 at the time. The land we owned was about 30 acres of mostly trees, and at the center of the property stands this old tree. The tree is not and has never been dead, but it would never grow any leaves and always looked dead. One particular day, I had come home from school, and as usual, my dad had not gotten home from work yet, as he often didn't until around 7, sometimes even later. So I had to entertain myself by finishing chores and eventually taking my dad's rifle, which is a simple .22 semi-auto, and walked the property. I didn't intend to actually hunt anything, the rifle was only for protection. Even though a .22 isn't much, it did make me feel safer. Anyway, I walked all the way down to the end of the property and goofed around a little before I noticed the sun was going down. Knowing I needed to head back before darkness set in, not because I could get lost, but because I wanted to be in the house before my dad got back, I picked up the pace. As I walked back, I began to hear footsteps in the trees to my left. I paid it little mind, mostly because it was midsummer and the woods are full of critters, so I assumed it was a squirrel or something similar. So I kept going. Keep in mind, my house is near the very front of the property, so it takes a long time to walk from the very back. As I continued, I could hear the footsteps getting louder and sounding very heavy. Now these woods are dense, but the trees are thin and spread out for about 50 or 60 yards deep from the path, so you can see fairly well into the trees. I couldn't see anything that could have been making that much noise. Given the size of the sound, you would think it would have been easy to spot, but there was nothing. I decided to stop and face the trees in the direction of the footsteps, not realizing where I was, almost perfectly in line with the aforementioned tree. I fired a few rounds into the woods and waited. I didn't hear anything, so I decided to move more quickly toward home. But as I turned and took a step toward home, the moment my foot touched the ground, I heard the voice of a woman whisper in my ear. What truly terrified me was that I felt the heat of her breath on my ear. My eyes experienced what I can only describe as a vertigo effect. It might seem anticlimactic, but it terrified me for a very, very long time. My second story takes place on the same property, but inside the house. A little backstory on the house. It was at least 100 years old. My dad told me that when we first moved there in the 90s, the house had no foundation or running water. On this day, I was around 12 years old and was on the second floor of the house, looking through one of those closets out of boredom. I accidentally stepped on one of my sister's old baby alive dolls, which started crying, making me jump because I didn't see it and wasn't expecting it. I picked it up to take the batteries out so it would stop. When I turned the doll around and opened the Velcro that hid the batteries, I noticed there were no batteries, and the entire housing for the battery pack was gone. The moment I noticed this, the doll started crying even louder and began to wiggle. I freaked out, threw the doll back into the closet, and ran down the stairs. As soon as I got to the stairs, I leaped from the top stair to the first floor in one bound and ran straight out the front door, where I stayed outside until my dad got home. This story I'm about to relay happened about 15 years ago when I was 6, so some of the details might have slipped through the cracks. However, I doubt I'll ever forget it. Every other weekend, my dad would take me to my mom's house for dinner. She was a headstrong Italian woman who took a lot of pride in cooking for her family. It was so funny to me because she had a car she never drove, a computer she never used, and a wine cellar that had been untouched for as long as I can remember. She walked everywhere, even with groceries in hand. Unfortunately, as a result, the rest of the house appeared to be frozen in time. It looked like it was stuck in the 70s, collecting dust in areas she didn't feel needed to be cleaned. Some of the wallpaper was starting to peel, and the bedrooms of her kids were starting to smell musty. Don't get me wrong, my mom was a fantastic woman and was far more active than most women her age. But the house was too big for her, so it was impossible for her to take care of every corner. My cousins and I used to explore the little nooks and crannies she had forgotten about. During one of our little excursions into the cellar, my cousin Georgia pulled out a Ouija board from a pile of old magazines and newspapers. I didn't have the foggiest clue what it was, so when my cousins Georgia, Annie, and Jonathan all told me I would be able to speak to ghosts with it, I was floored. It sounded scary, but it also sounded too cool to pass up. Georgia decided to perform the seance in the creepiest room of the house, the doll room. The doll room, as we called it, had to have been the most out-of-place room in the house. When my mom bought the house, it came with a wardrobe, a dimly lit painting of a man, and a built-in shelf for dolls of various sizes. No matter how many times we wandered into that room, we could never understand why she had such a room. We turned on the bedside lamp, set the board on the ground, and used a small glass cup in place of a planchette. Unsurprisingly, the planchette was lost somewhere in the clutter. My cousins goofed around a little, pulling the cup around just to scare me. I remember growing a little frustrated and feeling stupid for believing that ghosts were even real. They laughed until we all heard the familiar sound of something rolling against wood. All three of them fell silent. Slowly, we looked down at the cup. I recall it once sat leisurely between two letters, and now it sat firmly on the letter A. We exchanged baffled expressions for what felt like an eternity. I placed my hand on the glass, waiting for something to happen. Just when I was beginning to think it was somebody's foot knocking the glass around, I felt it jerk slightly to the right. I decided to push it in that general direction, thinking that something was trying to egg me on. My cousin started to snicker, thinking I was just pulling their legs. To this day, I argue with myself on whether it was just the power of suggestion or if something was really trying to contact me from the other side. I took my hand off the glass when we reached the letter L. We waited until we were content there wasn't going to be anything else following those two letters. Out of morbid curiosity, we asked L how he died. My cousins placed their fingers back on the cup. As they did, I'm not sure if they were just messing with me or if it was real, but the word that followed was fire. I remember Georgia nervously laughing and saying, "Okay, Al died in a fire. Do you want to talk to us?" The lamp flickered with almost a greenish glow for a split second, lighting the room as a lightning bolt would have. We were frozen in our spots. This could have just been a fluke. The house was ancient, and it wasn't like Mom was a master technician. Maybe the bulb was dying. Suddenly, Jonathan yelped, smacking his arm as if swatting at a mosquito. He insisted something shocked him. At that point, we decided to call it quits. We put the Ouija board back where we found it. Since there were news articles littered throughout the cellar, my cousins thought it would be a good idea to play detective to see if there was anything about a fire. After a few minutes, we grew bored of searching and ran back upstairs to tell the adults what we had found. Some of the adults glanced at each other with mock surprise and patronizing glances. My dad and uncle, however, seemed genuinely curious. On the ride home, my dad told me an interesting tale without a hint of his typical humor or goofiness. He told me about when he was about 12 years old, living in Mom's house with his brother and sisters. He recalled it was a hot summer night, so everyone, except for his sisters, had their doors open to help maintain air circulation. His sisters always kept their bedroom door shut because it was fairly noisy and would sometimes slam shut if a sudden draft reached in. He was lying on top of his blankets, watching the ceiling fan go around, when his peripheral vision caught something moving in his doorway. When he looked, he noticed a silhouette of someone peering around at his height, glancing into his room, before making its way down the hallway. At first, he thought it was his brother, since the silhouette was coming from the opposite direction of the bathroom. My dad thought he could bust his big brother for being out of bed. He slinked into the hallway and saw the figure dart around the corner towards his sister's shared bedroom. From there, his brother wouldn't be able to hide. He turned the corner only to be met with his sister's bedroom door. That was the first time he claimed that all the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he suddenly felt very vulnerable. He turned around towards his brother's room and saw him sleeping right on top of his blankets. My dad didn't get any sleep that night. Up until that point, he never believed in ghosts. I'd be skeptical of the story if it wasn't for the fact that I could still hear the shock in his voice. My dad told me that the Ouija board incident could have been my cousins trying to scare me, but he also said he wouldn't doubt for a second if something was really trying to contact us. When I was 10, my parents bought me a Furby for my birthday. It only said the same 3 phrases over and over again: I'm hungry, I'm tired, and I love you. After a couple of months of the Furby not being played with, it started opening its eyes and moving places while I slept. One day, the batteries finally died, and all it did was make a burr sound. After taking out the batteries, it continued to make noises. So, I ran a bath and tossed the Furby in it to try to shut it up. Then, I ran over to our microwave and threw the Furby in there to be cooked. As it was melting, its eyes and mouth flew open as if it was in shock at what I had just done. This next encounter happened a little bit later in life. I was at my ex's house a few years ago. Her sister and she were talking over a few cigarettes when I walked out. Her nephew's Furby, which he had on the table, opened its eyes and started talking about a dark island, and how the Furbies lived there in fear of what hid in the dark trying to eat them. Freaked out, we looked at each other to see if it had any batteries. Upon opening it up, we noticed no batteries were even in it, yet it continued to say it was in emotional pain and wanted to rescue its friends. I grabbed the Furby and smashed it on the ground. Then, I went into her shed, grabbed a shovel, smashed the Furby some more, and buried it in the backyard. After that, I have never owned another Furby again. I don't know what was making it malfunction, if it was possessed or what, but honestly, it's one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. I'm a Native American from a reservation in Michigan. In my younger years, my close friend, I'll call her M, and I decided to go back to our roots and set some snares. In the northern Michigan winter, there's snow and cold. This was so long ago, but I remember we wanted to utilize not only the meat for dinner, but also the hide for regalia. We decided to go south into a swampy area that had cedar and pines. We were looking for pathways that the rabbits used to set the snares when we noticed a clearing that seemed to have no snow. We both agreed to proceed towards what we saw. We both were getting creepy vibes as we approached the site. When I entered the circle, I saw jars with things in them all around. The freakiest thing was in the middle of this was a tree which, upon it, the vines grew toward the ground. Then there, in the fork of this tree, was a doll with its arms raised. The tree seemed to make a natural cove around this place, and I just wanted to get out of there. I had extreme butterflies and wanted to bolt. Em and I didn't touch anything and proceeded home as fast as we could through the snow without stopping. After we reached my grandparents' house, we told my grandmother what had happened, and she called our cousin, who was in the tribal police force. We told him everything after he showed up, and he said he would take care of it. I tried to forget about it. After he retired from the force, I decided to ask what had happened and if he indeed saw what Em and I saw. All he mentioned was that he did indeed see what we had described, and that they emptied the jars and dismantled the site. I wanted to know what was in the jars and pushed as much as I could, but he wouldn't say. I don't remember, or leave it be, is all he would tell me. Em is a nurse in Virginia now, and my cousin, may he rest in peace, is no longer with us. Here, where I live, I have experienced some weird things, but to me, this was the one that set a bit of fear into me when I was young. I wonder what that doll was for and what was in all those jars.